Whenever I say that I find Drew Barrymore to be overly performative, if not emotionally manipulative when it comes to her interviewing style and her talk show, people love to assume that I came to that conclusion because I'm just a hater and not because of her actual actions to portray her fellow artists, not to mention employees, by attempting to cross the picket line and bring back her show in the midst of an industry writer's strike. Even aside from that, which we'll get to in a minute, let's just address her interviewing style, period, which is fairly polarizing in and of itself. Like, you're either going to love it or you're going to hate it. But here we go. This entire show's premise was presented as one of extreme emotional vulnerability and authenticity, like an unapologetic departure from the professional office culture that we so often see when we're interviewing guests, for example, taking off shoes, sitting in more casual body positions, adopting body language that is much more intimate, like excessive eye contact, excessive touching, body proximity, all those types of things. And I'm a fan of all those things, but the problem is when you try to force your emotional intimacy onto others, therefore ending up making it emotional manipulation of sorts, however unintentional, because vulnerability is not something that can be forced onto someone, much like self-confidence. It's not something that can be demanded of someone. Emotional intimacy comes from trust, and trust has to be earned, not expected. So honestly, the very notion of such a huge talk show's premise being particularly about revolutionary emotional realness is a little paradoxical in and of itself. Some would call it naive, others might call it grossly strategic, but have we learned nothing from the 2000s pop stars interviews where we were constantly asking impressionable young teens leading questions in the hopes to get the elusive money making shot break down on camera? Do we not all remember poor Britney?
Diane Sawyer had you crying on television earlier.
Yes, she did.
Don't you think they could edit that stuff out a little
I
bit?
know, right? She's a great lady, but I mean, that was her mission in those interviews to make people cry, and I'm really kind of upset that I kind of broke like that, but it's all good.
My point is at the end of the day, if we're supposedly going for true, authentic conversations, not all of those exchanges and interactions are going to be steeped in emotional effusiveness. And only prioritizing the more raw and emotional something is just as bad as what you were trying to correct, which is the guarded formality of so many interviews. It's just an overcorrection because if we're expecting every single interaction to be anything, then we're capitalizing off of it by almost fetishizing it, by insisting something be a certain way. And instead of just allowing it to be the way it is, it becomes a shtick, if you will, as opposed to, say, a mission statement. Another thing is that not only do so many of the guests look so visibly uncomfortable being interviewed by Drew, but many of the viewers have expressed their discomfort watching the show as well. And as an interviewer, it is your job to think about and be aware of how your guests feel, not just how you feel or how you look, like for no other reason than to get the best possible interview you can, which is not going to happen if you're operating foremost from a self-centric place as opposed to focusing on your guests and their unique needs and, comforts. It actually kind of reminds me of acting a lot in the sense that you can be the best actor in the world, but if you can't adapt to the life circumstances of your scene or your scene partner or something that's not supposed to change, whatever it is, it doesn't matter because it's not a monologue, it's a scene. And it's a little crazy going into any situation with the absolute mindset of extremes and no room to budge. I am the emotional interviewer. This is my emotionally available show. I will not adjust. I will approach every interview the same way because it's like going on autopilot. Because, and this is what most people are going to miss. It's not bad to want to be emotionally open to the point of radical authenticity. It's bad to need to do that to the point where you insist on enforcing that all the time and end up missing the integral nuances of the varied ways that people feel comfortable communicating. Because then it's not about true communication anymore. Do you understand? Sure, some guests seem to love her style. Maybe you do too, but many don't. And for the very, very valid reasons that this behavior indicates that she is not a great listener sometimes, which is the entire premise of the show. It's like when someone tries to pet a dog that they don't know and they really want the dog to open up to them and they immediately get in their face and smother them. And it's like, oh, but I'm loving you, I'm hugging you. And then they get surprised when the dog might have some like reactions because it's not about you. Even when it comes to love, we often express love the way we want to be loved, never considering that a partner might need to feel love in a different way. Again, intention versus impact. But let's talk about the impact, shall we? People love to say when it comes to my critique of her show that that's just your opinion. Just because she's touchy-feely doesn't make her performative. And you're right. No, that doesn't just make her performative. But basing your entire show and persona on having real and difficult conversations and listening to people, especially artists, only to then go and stab those people in the back by crossing the picket line during the WGA strike, that does, right? Performative niceness versus actionable integrity. And if you don't care about writers, if you don't think there's anything ugly about pretending to stand up for all of these things while essentially saying that the writers that helped create your show are not only replaceable, but not even that important, because you could always shift more towards improv-based content as opposed to scripted, whatever it is.
If you don't care about how essential unions are to artists' rights, and that includes child actors, by the way, if you don't care about the solidarity and the industry as a whole because you insist on denying the intersectionality of how one industry will inevitably affect another,
that's a whole separate thing. But those are things that Drew, especially as a child actor herself, have claimed to care about. And it doesn't really matter if you care about them. It matters if someone else claims to care about them to the point of making money off of the claims by creating a show about emotional honesty, only to prove otherwise with your actions. It honestly makes me think about the Australian breakdancer Ray Gunn in the sense that no matter the intention she might have had when she crashed the Paris Olympics to execute her thesis and the real life form of some social experiment in the name of the culture, it's the apparent exasperation at people's response to her actions that I find a little alarming. It's the surprise she had to the point of insisting people were the bullies when the consequences of her own actions were met with backlash. In statements that she released, she also seemed to justify her actions by proposing that it was for the sake of the culture, for society, not just because of tone deafness on her part. And I'm actually going to quote an article from Vox here. Our show was built for sensitive times and has only functioned through what the real world is going through in real time. Barrymore posted on the social media platform stating that she was making the choice to come back for the first time in this strike for our show that may have my name on it, but this is bigger than just me. There's so much wrong and weird with that explanation, including a little bit of grandiosity that's just a little bit alarming that we don't even need to get into. But again, just as I pointed out with Rachel Gunn's reasoning behind squandering an opportunity so many would have died for, this is also an example of prioritizing concepts, especially when it comes to activism over actual people, because suddenly it becomes okay to steal from a few to serve the elusive many that conveniently never have any specific names because it's not about specific people. It's just a convenient argument that poses the person as some type of altruistic academic or activist that is free from critique because they were doing it for others. So, whether we're talking about Blake Lively not listening to the actual feedback from DV survivors on her movie that was about DV, or whether we're talking about academic Ray Gunn choosing to listen to fellow academics instead of the actual breakdancers who she assaulted in the name of breakdancing, or whether we're talking about Drew Barrymore making decisions that are canonically antithetical to the premise of what her and her show are supposedly about, the pattern is the same, which is a certain lack of self-awareness at best. And one could make the argument that Drew Barrymore is allowed to act how she wants to act on her show. Who cares if it's crossing boundaries, actually emotionally inappropriate when it comes to guests? It's her show. After all, look at Hot Ones. Perhaps it's the type of situation where people will know what they're getting into ahead of time and have the option to participate or not, or even watch it or not. But again, the issue is not about whether or not you like what is being presented, whether or not you're a fan of the values and the concepts of the show, but actually instead whether or not you think that those values and concepts that you are a fan of are actually being demonstrated and not just promised. Because no one is saying you can't love seeing people eat spicy food, but would you still love it if you found out that the food wasn't actually spicy? Would the concept of loving spicy food be enough for you to still watch it and defend the show? Drew also even recently acknowledged her attempt to work on personal space moving forward. So we know that she's at least somewhat aware of the discourse over her interviewing style alone, aside from the whole strike fiasco. So I guess we'll see. Because I don't hate Drew Barrymore any more than I hate Kim K or Blake Lively or anyone that I make videos on. They're humans that we do not know, not to mention celebrities. But the problem is when you decide to go into a very public career where you are profiting off of not only the monetary support of the public who buy your work in the form of merch, movies, music, etc., but also our literal focus, our literal attention, then discourse is not only inevitable, but also very sociologically important. It's how society gets better at important things like differentiating between performative niceness and actionable integrity, actionable, actual kindness and activism that translates into tangible results, even if it's not packaged in some palatable form of like performative sweetness, if that makes any sense. Because I'm the type of person that tries not to tone police people because I try not to let my own fragility and need for arbitrary validation make me look like a fool by duping me into believing people that I shouldn't. I mean, maybe if we cared more about policies as opposed to presentation, we wouldn't turn elections into the swamp fire they are now. There's a bug in here. Maybe we should stop focusing so much on how people are saying things, like the substance, not the surface, which is difficult because that is all inherently a part of human nature. And after all, we don't want to overcorrect and train people out of empathy and desensitize them to emotional effusiveness, as we are seeing happen on social media with the proliferation of fake skits that inevitably lead people to feeling bitter after they fell for someone else's fake sob story. So again, it's a balance. But especially if you're an artist, what do you think?